Hello, welcome everybody. If you could come in and sit down real quickly, we'll get going. We're like 16 minutes late, so let's just try to kick this thing off. We have about an hour and 5 minutes at this point to saw through all this little tiny topic that we have that's not broad at all. So why don't we take a seat? Today's discussion is called The Evolution of the Internet Governance Ecosystem. And I have a great panel here, some friends of mine who from years ago and some from friends I've just met. And we'll get going on that discussion. The hashtag Twitter for this particular discussion is IGFUSAIG, which is up here as a hashtag. And you can pose questions on the Twitter sphere, and I will read them, or we'll have somebody over there read them as well. We'll save about 20 minutes for audience Q&A, and that's question and answer. The answers are going to be from the panelists. The questions are going to be for the audience. So it's not C&A, which would be comment and answer. It's going to be question and answer. So let me just quickly, the panelists are all top-notch folks. Their bios are in this packet, and you can read them at your leisure. I will just quickly introduce them very, very briefly as I go right down the panel. Ambassador David Cross. I mean, Ambassador David Gross is with Wiley Ryan and Fielding, and it's misspelled up there, by the way. Professor DeNardis with American University, who's written several books on this particular topic. Next to her, we have Karen Rose from the Internet Society. And next to her is Sarah Myers-West, who made a terrific flight down here from Boston today. Just made it in time, and we're happy that she did so. She's with the Annenberg School at USC, but also writes for Global Voices. And last, but certainly not least, is Shane Tews, who's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So let's just get going today. Not do any housekeeping. We're all set to go. So my name is Tim Lorden. I am the executive director of the Internet Education Foundation, and we do a lot of different things, briefing of Congress, a lot of different projects on internet issues, and a big slice of that is internet governance, and we do some panels now and again on that particular topic. We did a panel at State of the Net last January, and in introducing the topic, Milton Mueller, a professor from Syracuse, said, welcome to the formerly underappreciated topic of internet governance. It's all of a sudden hot. Some of these issues are really a big deal now. The fact that during the IANA announcement by NTIA about the IANA transition, you had some members of Congress actually paying attention to what that meant, and maybe not really understanding what it meant, but certainly paying attention to it is a big deal. In 15 or 20 years of internet governance, 10 years ago, Professor Mueller wrote a book called Ruling the Root. And it was kind of the first look at kind of a lot of these issues and putting them in context. So today we're going to have a quick discussion about the evolution of the internet governance ecosystem and why these issues now all of a sudden appreciated. I think Chris Painter in the last session said that cybersecurity is the new black. You know, people are interested in this stuff now, which is really, really cool. But it's also scary. The internet is a disruptive technology, and it scares the heck out of people. It scares the heck out of me that my father has a cell phone and can text me. That's frightening. My mother's on Facebook. That's really disturbing. And all of a sudden, you people paying attention to things like 760,000 comments on net neutrality as of today or yesterday. You have the internet goes black over the SOPA legislation in Congress. People are paying attention to these things more, and more. So that's kind of why we're here. That's why the focus is on this issue and why people are trying to figure out what internet governance means or what the ecosystem looks like. Professor DeNardis is going to kind of tee us off here. She's written a book called The Global War on Internet Governance. That sounds kind of scary. That's like
for internet governance.
Oh, it's for internet governance or against it. So why don't you kind of set the stage for us about, what is the internet governance ecosystem? What is internet governance? What are the kind of intersection points or with regard to this particular topic?
Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations to the organizers for putting together this wonderful day, which I'm enjoying very much. The term internet governance is a general term that means the administration and coordination of the technologies that are necessary to keep the internet operational, and then the enactment of substantive policy around those technologies. One important point to make that we've heard here today is that internet governance is distinct from the term governments. So it involves technical design and administration. It involves the policy-making function of private companies and the private agreements that they make to interconnect and do other things. Of course, the work of new global institutions like ICANN is part of that, and then also national laws and intergovernmental agreements. But much of internet governance, I must start by saying, is not done by governments. That's why the term can be very confusing. Another point to make, and I think the term ecosystem that defines this panel captures this, is that it's not one thing, obviously. We see that today in the agenda. There are hundreds of coordination points and control points over the internet and levers that are necessary to keep it operational. Now, this does include the management of critical internet resources by ICANN and the regional internet registries, the IANA functions, domain name system operators. That's an ecosystem in and of itself. Even that's not one thing. But even that area is only one part of internet governance. It also includes standard setting by institutions such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, obviously, the World Wide Web Consortium, IEEE, and others. It includes cybersecurity functions, policy-making role of private companies like Google, who have to navigate all kinds of requests from governments and deal with cyberbullying and deal with defamation and all those complicated issues that exist in the offline world as well. And I would also add interconnection and routing and intellectual property rights enforcement. So when you go through all of that, you realize that when people ask a question of who should control the internet, that just doesn't make any sense. It is an ecosystem, so I'm glad that this panel was described as such. Now, I'll just mention one other thing. There are a lot of themes that cut across all of those different areas of internet governance. One theme is that arrangements of technology are always also arrangements of power, in that even the most technical functions have a policy-making role. Second theme is the privatization of governance, in that whether this is just a descriptive observation that much of the work is done by the private sector. So we have governance moving into private ordering, which is very interesting. And then third theme is an important one, and that's that internet governance debates often become or descend into proxies for other kinds of political arguments. So we see things like a global outcry. I travel a lot. I'm out doing a book tour and traveling internationally quite a lot right now. And we see a lot of concern about the NSA surveillance disclosures. But then that's taken and then applied to another area, such as the root zone file, which has nothing to do with surveillance. So we see a lot of proxies around these debates and political agendas. So there is an important global geopolitical debate underway. I think it's appropriate because the stable operation and secure operation of the internet really should rank among other kinds of global collective action problems like environmental rights, human rights, and basic infrastructural systems of finance, energy, and other types of infrastructure. So happy to be on this panel, and that's my long-winded definition of internet governance.
Great, great. So I'm glad you mentioned the NSA, because you can't have a conversation in the city without mentioning the NSA on any particular topic whatsoever. So that's really important. And I think going forward, we had former FCC Commissioner McDowell speak on a panel not too long ago, and it was before the Dubai meeting for the ITU, and he said, that's just one of them. Like going forward, we have the WSIS 10, we got this meeting, we got this meeting, and then in Turkey, we got this meeting going forward. And I'm sure all of you could rattle off all the different internet governance forums and discussions and meetings that are going to be going on for the next 12 or 13 months. It's really kind of a shocking amount of work to go to all these different things. As we go forward, what do you think? And I think throw it out to maybe Shane and Sarah, and perhaps come back to David. What are the kind of the biggest challenges going forward? You mentioned Laura, you mentioned the NSA. The reaction, that was only 13 months ago that the first revelations from Edward Snowden came out, and already we're seeing governments move in the direction of maybe data localization, the splinterization of the internet. What are the challenges going forward with regard to this entire internet governance ecosystem and all the meetings that we have coming up in the next 13 months?
So I'm going to start with probably one of the hottest topics here in Washington the last couple months was the IANA function. at NTIA and the misunderstanding of what that function does. And I thought Congressman Walden did a great job of explaining why Congress has some concerns and wants some answers and asking the GAO to do that. But there is, it just seems, it's gotten lost in a lot of the media story that the IANA function it's very technical, as is most of the layers of the internet. And what it does is worked so efficiently because most people didn't know it even existed. And now that it's gotten attention, part of the challenge, and the NTIA team has done a great job with this, of continuing to try to explain this as they go forward, that it needs to not be politicized. Politicizing the IANA function is actually the worst thing that could happen to it. So that's something that we'll see within the dialogue for the next couple months. Obviously, there are opportunities to be involved in those discussions going forward in the coordinating committee that's meeting in London starting May, I think tomorrow, as part of the ICANN function, and then the whole ICANN accountability. There's a lot of things that lead on to that. But I think helping people understand the importance of the IANA function and its technical capabilities is a big lift that we'll be seeing going on for the next couple months.
Sarah?
So I thought I would point out just a couple of major trends that I've been observing as I follow these issues. One was
Sarah, is your microphone on?
Sure. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, sorry about that. So one of those trends is occurring within what's traditionally seen as the internet governance space, and two are sort of a little bit outside, but I think very relevant to internet governance. First is the increased globalization of the internet governance discussion, and the IANA transition is a really key part of that, but it's not the full encompassing aspect of it. I think that we're seeing a growing strength of voices from the global south, as we saw with Brazil's involvement in creating the Net Mundial, CGI.br, and the Marco Civil. And in the midst of these multiplicity of dialogues that we're having, we've seen a few principles that are starting to coalesce, and I spent some time comparing principles from the WSIS plus 10 dialogue, the Net Mundial, as well as the high-level panel report that came out recently. And generally, they tend to agree on transparency, accountability, and participation. Where they differ is how to implement them globally, particularly given that there's a great diversity of cultures and languages as well as technical knowledge. So I think that one of the big trends that we're going to see is that there needs to be a larger public component to IG efforts to bring people onto the same page. Secondly, and I think this might have been touched on at some of the earlier panels, is the role of corporations in increasingly shaping our experiences online. Many users, rather than type in domain names, are typing in issues into their Google search engine. So corporate terms of services are increasingly playing an important role in internet governance, but they're not really at the moment a part of these discussions. So that's one significant space that these internet governance fora don't currently reach, and the discussion of that shift has really only just begun. Lastly, I would want to highlight that there are a number of bottom-up initiatives that have been brought up by civil society, things like Reset the Net and the Web We Want, that are not aimed at the traditional participants in internet governance discussions. They're aimed at those who either don't currently participate or at the next billion users. So I think that those are three trends to watch in the evolution of the internet governance ecosystem.
David, do you want to weigh on this? I have a question. I'm going to go off script. I have a question from Twitter, if any would, I think it's relevant at the moment. Does the the question about these kind of internet governance processes as part of this larger tapestry of the internet governance ecosystem, the question from Joseph Wright, does the proliferation of IG events undermine multi-stakeholder model because of the resources needed to participate consistently? And I just ticked off just a few. You mentioned London. We have a bunch of these events, meetings coming up. How does civil society participate? How do the internet stakeholders, how do they participate? Is it just so many meetings on this larger internet governance ecosystem that just normal folks just can't really participate?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate. And the problem that was just discussed and is one that's been with us forever. The issue of resources is an ongoing problem. It's certainly not a new one. I think probably it reflects more than anything else the greater, maybe even the universal interest in these subjects, where before it was much more limited. But it's been true as an issue, and it goes very much to the heart of the evolving multi-stakeholder approach that the U.S. and like-minded governments have long advocated very strongly, and it's been a problem. Some of the parts of the multi-stakeholder universe are well-funded and can participate, others are not. That's geographically true, that is substantively true. How do you deal with that set of questions? It's a challenge. It's a challenge that governments often point out because they view themselves this as being a big issue. In the developing world, many governments can't attend all these meetings, no less civil society, no less the corporate and private sector as well. So this is a real challenge. I don't think it's a challenge that will keep us from moving forward on these debates. And instead, I think the key here is you don't try to be everywhere all the time on all issues. You have to prioritize. Some discussions are clearly more important than others. I would point out, for example, although we sort of naturally tend to talk about internet governance as being an international set of issues, as you pointed out, Tim, the meetings that you referred to are primarily international, and thank goodness are usually in interesting places, so we enjoy going there and seeing old friends. But in fact, many of the most important internet governance discussions are domestic. The ones we're having here in the United States about net neutrality, about the IANA transfer, about these things go because it affects all of us. So you don't have to travel to Istanbul to play a substantive role in these issues.
But it's nice when you can.
It's always good to be in Istanbul. I think that's exactly right.
Karen.
Yeah, I think the proliferation of internet governance forums is actually a really great thing and a real good proof point about how the multi-stakeholder model, the inclusive model, is really being picked up around the world. It wasn't too long ago when many of us were sitting around and thinking, is this idea of multi-stakeholderism, of broader participatory internet governance going to catch on? And there was a question of whether or not it would happen at all. And I think that we've seen at high-level meetings like things like Net Mundial, but also meetings like regional IGFs, national IGFs, that multi-stakeholderism is really being picked up as a mechanism to address real and substantive issues. And going back to the question that you were asking around the table, while we're still having a lot of discussions in internet governance about critical internet resources, things like global equity and influence and decision-making and security and human rights and privacy, if you look at the things that are coming up on, for example, the global IGF agenda, a lot of things, these are very sort of domestic in nature and tend to address some problems that I think us sometimes in the developed world don't quite appreciate as much. So for example, in the global IGF, access promotion and infrastructure continues to come up as an issue that's deemed worthy in talking about in terms of internet governance contexts. Content creation and use, how to use the internet for growth and economic development. And even such issues as like spam prevention. We saw this issue come up at Wicket, for example, but it does come up as an issue that many countries, especially in emerging economies, really want to have a venue and an opportunity to find solutions and address. So while there is this proliferation of forums, I think it's actually a indication of success. That the multi-stakeholder model is seen as a value, it's seen as a sign of wisdom rather than weakness in decision making, and that we do, I think, especially in the developed world, need to really listen to the issues that are emerging from emerging economies and developing countries as we move forward in the discussions.
So Karen, before I want to pick up on something you said about multi-stakeholderism, but before I do, you just got back from Rwanda. So one of these discussions, one of the multi-stakeholder process. Can you kind of give us some idea of what lessons were learned, the good, the bad, the ugly from Rwanda?
Yeah, I think in general, in picking up on what Assistant Secretary Strickling mentioned, is that there's a lot of really great examples and proof points of multi-stakeholderism really taking shape around the world, obviously in different ways. CGI in Brazil, things that are going on in places like Lebanon. And when I was in Rwanda, I was there to talk about local content human issues. The Rwandan government, I think, is a real exemplar of a country and a government that is really taking multi-stakeholderism to heart. Government is actually trying to transition over to industry and other stakeholder conversations and trying to get industry and stakeholders to actually do more in helping to make decisions. So it was very funny. I was sitting on this panel with the minister, and he was basically sort of chiding stakeholders to step up and take a more active role so government wasn't the sole influencer in these discussions. So I think that's a really great example of where there are champions for the multi-stakeholder model that we really need to pay attention to and to learn from in terms of how they're trying to push a more inclusive, open, and transparent decision-making model.
Well, let me pick up on that. So you're saying that governments are, they don't want to be as involved. But on the other hand, governments have a vested, they are sovereign, and within the borders of their country, they want to shape the internet rules that are in their country. In these multi-stakeholder processes, do you see governments having more influence or less influence? And I'd ask anybody on the panel to answer that. Lara?
I'd be happy to talk about multi-stakeholder internet governance. I liked what Ambassador Sepulveda said this morning. There's no single bullet for this. It's a very complicated area. I mean, what we often describe, and I describe internet governance as multi-stakeholder governance, which just vaguely means shared responsibility of governments and private industry and civil society. What I want to do to answer your question is to raise some caveats about this. I would love to have a day-long discussion which does not use the term multi-stakeholder, because it actually has become a meme or a value in and of itself. It has to have more meaning. What do we mean by that? So some caveats. Should we use that as a value in and of itself, or should we be more concerned about what kind of governance is necessary in different areas to preserve things like human rights or security or stability of the internet? That's one caveat that I would suggest. I would also say, and I don't know if the panel will agree with me, but I would provocatively say maybe we don't want multi-stakeholder governance in every area of administering the internet.
For instance?
Well, there are some areas that are, perfectly relegated to the government. Like if someone has identity theft, engages in identity theft, I want to be able to have help from the government. In other areas like private contractual agreements among companies, that's in the private sector. So should there be shared governance of that, or should there just be mechanisms of oversight and accountability? So I would say that each area is different. Now, furthermore, and this ties into the previous question about how to engage, the expense of engaging in these multi-stakeholder processes. I would say that the Internet Governance Forum is not at all internet governance. So it's important to say that.
So an organization called the Internet Governance Forum is not internet governance?
It's not the practice of internet
governance. So they only got one of the three words right.
It is the discussion. It's all the words are right. All the words are right. But it is, it's a dialogue, it's a discussion, it's a deliberation about internet governance. And the actual practice of internet governance is what goes on while these discussions are happening. So what that can do is it can sometimes make people feel like they're involved in internet governance, or feel like civil society is represented, and I would say civil society isn't adequately enough represented in these dialogues. But the real question is how you extend that feeling and actuality of multi-stakeholder participation into the areas that truly should be multi-stakeholder. So it's a dialogue, and I would just put those caveats out.
Well, Shane had an opening salvo talking about the INF function. I don't want to go too deep into that because there's another panel breakout coming up shortly on the INF function, and Steve Del Bianco is moderating that. And if we take too much of his thunder, he'll come down here and hit me with a club or something. So let's not get too deep into it. But it's a technical kind of function, and so it seems like these internet governance forums and these multi-stakeholder models, seem to be kind of working on those issues. Now we get to another layer, which is like kind of the content. You had mentioned copyright. You mentioned other issues, like we have privacy. And we have a question from the Twitter from Evan Schwartztraber, who says, how does the right to be forgotten EU ruling affect overall conversation about global IG, ICANN, etc.? So he's asking about the European right to be forgotten case, and where you're in Europe, you'd have a right to say, I really don't want that to be a search term about me, even though it might happen to be true. How does that play, those kind of sovereign issues, if you could call the EU a sovereign, how do those play into this conversation?
So I think part of it is the challenge that many of us have in this group of the lack of understanding of the multi-layers in the infrastructure. So content is obviously very important because it's what makes the internet interesting to 99.9% of the users. But you look at, what Google's challenge is, and if you've been following, I've been doing it through the media, how, so they're saying, okay, so I'm gonna try to take your name out of somebody's searches for Tim Lorden, and I'm gonna, not connect it to the Boston Globe article about what a great time you had on the 4th of July and you made it on the front page of the paper. That's just fictitious. And then, but the Boston Globe can still run the fictitious photo of you, and then you have people from the European Commission coming in and saying, well, we don't think it's Google's right to choose what they can and can't have on their search engine. So it's going to be a really fascinating topic, and it's thoroughly, keeps me engaged from like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. when I have insomnia, when there's not some internet governance forum I could be watching around the world.
Well, I think it's a useful reminder, that issue and many others, that these domestic or regional issues are really of global importance. And one of the things which I've tried to consistently remind people, because it's easy, I think, to forget, is as we have these discussions about these very important issues like net neutrality and others that are very difficult, very controversial here in the United States, the world is watching. The world watches what we do, what we decide, how we go about those processes. And so even the decisions that don't necessarily automatically affect the rest of the world, like the Diana transition that arguably does, but even things we do domestically are very international in focus, very important internationally, and should sober those who think that only if we just do it here, it doesn't necessarily affect the rest of the world. It can substantively, but just in fact that we're doing it is in fact very important.
Okay. Is the subtext that, is part of the subtext that on the infrastructure layer, on the kind of the critical functions layer, multi-stakeholderism kind of works, but perhaps on content, we're going to leave it to the sovereign. Is that, would you agree or disagree with that premise? And the content being copyright, right to be forgotten, some of those things.
I think that's our largest next challenge, trying to figure out how you manage through that. You look at what Twitter's having to work with right now with Russian legislation, what they've dealt with in Pakistan, what they've been dealing with off and on in Turkey, and how do you manage through, and that's at a level where, you have certain government, people that decide that they want something one week and not the next. And then, David, to your point, I loved it when Putin said about a month and a half ago that the CIA had invented the internet just to spy on us, and to quote our friend John Newer, he said, well, you're welcome. So, there's just a certain level of, I think that's where we're going next in a lot of the internet governance discussion is how do we manage through the infrastructure layers and where do you find the right and wrong on that? Because somebody doesn't want it on there, does that mean that it's now I don't have the option to see it? And I think we're dealing with that at multiple layers, even with here in the United States. We see some of this at the state and local level.
I don't think I would agree with the statement that you made provocatively that
It was more
content,
a question. It wasn't a statement.
You just put a hypothetical question out there, right? I wouldn't agree that content should fall upon governments to be the primary internet governance mechanism, because the way that things work is that we have the technical mediation of the public sphere, and then we have the privatization of the conditions of civil liberties within that sphere. We have information intermediaries, the fancy term for search engines, social media companies, reputation engines, and content aggregation sites. And it falls upon those private companies to enforce intellectual property rights through notice and takedown, for example. It falls upon them to set privacy policies that often transcend what national policies are. It falls upon them to figure out how to deal with cyberbullying. So I would say that it's both government and also private industry to not regulate, but to govern content.
So you didn't agree with the premise that that technical operations, multi-stakeholderism in internet governance is fine, but for content, it's not. You don't agree?
I think that one area that.
And if so,
Yes.
does that mean that we need more internet governance forums and more multi-stakeholder processes to deal with privacy, like right to be forgotten, or to deal with some larger intellectual property issues?
Yeah, the term balancing rights is probably the right one, and a lot of people don't like that because we like to think about all rights being protected, but someone's privacy is another person's censorship. So it is, it's a very difficult area. I mean, one area, how do you put the bounds around what should be a multi-stakeholder and what shouldn't is really the question. And I would say that in an area such as the administration of critical internet resources, where there's a technical requirement that each identifier be globally unique, that is something that is very difficult to delegate to specific nations. You know, it's something that is I don't want to use the word scarce resource, but it is a unique resource. And so the fact that ICANN is multi-stakeholder is appropriate in that kind of an area.
Okay. Let me ask one question that the organizers asked me to ask, and maybe we can start with Sarah, who needs to get some airtime. We kind of talked, Professor Denars, you did a good job of just defining what kind of multi-stakeholderism is, and I didn't disagree with any part of it. So now that we kind of have a sense of what multi-stakeholderism is, with regard to how do you think it goes with regard to the ITU efforts to kind of have more government control over the internet? So multi-stakeholderism, should governments be more involved in multi-stakeholderism or less in this kind of internet governance ecosystem?
I mean, to be honest, that's a very tricky question because it's sort of, I've spent quite a bit of time trying to grasp what multi-stakeholderism is in the first place, and I think it's a relatively slippery term because it's used to different ends and by different people and in different contexts. So I think that there is clearly some role for governments to play in the multi-stakeholder system. There are existing international legal frameworks, there are existing international bodies. So ideally, a multi-stakeholder system would be able to both be participatory and bottom-up, but also be able to interface with those existing international bodies. Otherwise, I think we deal with a lot of conflict and domain overlap.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting at this issue of sort of what does multi-stakeholderism mean and what are multi-stakeholder processes. You know, one of the things that we tend to think about at the Internet Society is sort of the characteristics and values of multi-stakeholderism, and how much those kinds of principles are reflected in decision-making processes. I think when we talk about decision-making on various issues, when it comes to things like content, when it comes to things like critical resources, one of the things that's always been recognized is that there is really no sort of one-size-fits-all model for this, and different organizations have different roles and responsibilities within the overall framework of internet governance. But a couple of the things that we think really characterizes multi-stakeholderism and its values is that the processes are open, inclusive, and transparent, where any stakeholder can participate and have their voice heard, and that there's processes in place for transparent, informed, and collaborative decision-making. So those are some of the things that we think really sort of characterize multi-stakeholder models. And in reference to your question about the ITU, the more that the ITU can move in that particular direction, I think would be quite welcomed by many of us.
Okay. And David, I'll let you follow up, but in the meantime, I think we have some questions from the audience. Please get them ready. We have somebody with wireless microphones. They'll come down and hand them to you if they have a question. Questions are welcome. Comments, please don't.
I think one of the things that I think is worthy of us thinking about as we step back and look at the way in which this is all evolving is that we clearly are seeing substantial changes in the conversation and the nature of the conversation, including the term multi-stakeholderism has gone from sort of off to one side to mainstream to now being viewed as perhaps inadequate. So we're moving in that sense. Obviously, as the technology changes, that creates a whole different set of dynamics. We're not talking by definition about a static environment, but rather one that is constantly changing. Therefore, these issues need to be addressed in a constantly changing environment. And I would note one of the lessons that I took out of Net Mundial that I think is worthy of people thinking a little more deeply about are some of the dynamics. It was held in probably as close to a multi-stakeholder type of environment where that term is traditionally used. There were 4 sets of microphones, 4 sets of actors there: civil society, governments, academics, and the private sector. And it was interesting to watch the final decision-making there. It was coming out with a document. It was a messy but an interesting process, and worthy, I think, of important academic study about this. Governments, by and large, had no problem negotiating. Some agreed, some did not with the ultimate outcome, but they were very comfortable in that process. I would say the private sector was reasonably comfortable in that process. Academics were academics and therefore comfortable in all situations. They were just happy to be invited. But the fourth group, and perhaps in my sense maybe the most significant, that is civil society, the group that has been knocking on the door to want to participate, had what I thought was a very difficult time. And they had a very difficult time because institutionally for them and their organizations, it is very hard to get to yes. Because if they agree to something, particularly with governments and with others, there's always somebody to the other side who will criticize and say they weren't hard enough, they weren't strong enough, they didn't hold the position long enough. And that raises, I think, as we look ahead, an interesting set of dynamic problems about what role is played, because ultimately what decision makers will have at the table will be people who can get to a decision. And I ask this as a question and I'm more as an observation, but as we talk about this evolving internet ecosystem, I think that may be one of the underappreciated difficulties as we go ahead.
So do we have any questions from the audience? I got one right, the 2 women right here. And if, when you get the microphone, if you could identify yourself and who you're with, that'd be very, very helpful for us.
Thank you. It's nice to be first. Marion Gordon from the State Department. First of all, this is to thank the panel. This strikes me as a very timely topic and a very important one for where we are now. Can you get to the mic, please? Okay, how about this?
Yeah.
That's better. Great. I'm thanking the panel, and I'm saying that it's a timely panel. I'm also recognizing that a number of us who are in this audience participated at the recent ITU WSIS Plus 10 high-level event. This event was one, perhaps most briefly stated, that evaluated the WSIS action lines from the first WSIS. Perhaps it could be described by some as a breakthrough event for the reason that all who participated in the event agreed to negotiated and consensus text. If I can say to Ambassador Gross, I feel it deeply. We actually got to a decision. So very good news. I'm taking the microphone to say that there are so many other events that are occurring regarding WSIS Plus 10 as we evaluate whether or not WSIS has been successful and whether or not progress has been made. And my question is, does the IGF see that it has a role to inform widely, to let stakeholders, to let governments know of perhaps some of the most important meetings that are occurring so that we can have the broadest participation and the most voices brought to bear on these issues that so many of us know are so important? Thank you.
You're looking at me.
I think she pointed at you.
All right, okay. Always great to see Marion. Thank you very much. And for everybody who don't know, Marion has been an extraordinarily important part of this whole process for a good number of years. I was going to say many, but that would be inappropriate, but a good number of years on these things, and has been a key leader on it. I would note on the WSIS Plus 10, that was a very messy process at the end, so I'm not sure that really proves out that these things always do have happy endings. But in terms of having the IGF be a place for pointing out the most important, I would sort of, I sort of look at it almost from the flip side, because I'm certainly happy. The more information spread, the more focus. One of the problems we all have is trying to figure out what really matters. There's a lot of places where the conversation is going forward, and it's often hard to know what matters, other than we know certain ones really matter a lot, like treaty writing conferences, like the ITU Plenipotentiary later this year, and the like. The UNGA, WSIS plus 10 event that will probably take place towards the end of next year. But if we start to look at it that way, we're sort of defining what is important by where governments gather. On the other hand, one could say that the ICANN meetings 3 times a year are extraordinarily important because they're very lively and there's a lot of decisions being made and a lot of commerce being done. So I think part of the problem is knowing where they are, and I think different people will have very different views about the importance of each one of those meetings.
Shane?
I was gonna say, there's also part of what I think the Internet Governance Forum can become, and I'm going to steal from a conversation I had last night with Peter Dengate-Thrush, which he was saying that, there's a certain point where you hit a point in the dialogue, and then maybe it needs to be moved out of IGF and into its own specific forum. So children online safety, for example. If you get a coalition of people that really want to work on that, it doesn't need to continue to live in the Internet Governance Forum. It needs to maybe move forward into a problem-solving area. And I think that's a little bit of the confusion, David, you were saying about the 4th group that showed up at Net Mundial. They're like, it's kind of like you're standing in line going, am I in the right line? Is this going to solve my problem? I have a problem. And, there's a lot of people who have been in this process a long time and are very adept at, shepherding through and knowing which room to be in. And then there's a group of people standing in the lobby that are like, I was told that this would be helpful. And, so I think we're trying to figure out through a multiplicity of these processes, the people who go to IETF or the people that are, at IAB, they've been doing this for a really long time, and they are very quiet and very efficient about what they do. They don't, we're probably invited, but we don't know it. And then there's, forums like this where there's a lot of dialogue, and maybe we need to help move the dialogue forward into the next best forum. And I know we've had a discussion about having kind of, best practices come out of these events. And so I think, the WSIS plus 10 was very useful, and it's, for people that follow this, it's helpful. I think it's the next layer out that are trying to figure out when they engage, when they go to the expense of going to a meeting, when you can do it remotely, and then how do you best participate to have the positive outcome that you're looking for.
I think we had a question right here.
So my name is Courtney Radge with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and my question is for the moderator, but I think also for the ambassador, because you hit the nail on the head, which is governments and private sector and even academics have preset fora in which they can come together and kind of agree on positions or key issues in advance of these sort of meetings, whereas civil society is such a diverse group and lacks those institutions. And my question is why this forum, but also the IGF, is set up with panels where you have a limited set of, representatives. You have to have kind of an equal number. I wanted to have a round table at the IGF. It's been forced to be into a panel. I'm going to do it my way once we get there. But nonetheless, the moderator, you said we don't want any comments. So my question is, why don't you want comments from the audience if this is about discussing and having a dialogue on these issues? I think that if we set up these very important discussions as panels, where panels are talking at the audience and the audience is allowed to ask questions, that's especially problematic for civil society, especially civil society who are, say, new entrants to this space.
Wow, I think I've been, I think I stand corrected, right? I think it's a very, very valid point that this is a dialogue. I'm still trying to figure out what IGF USA is, and that was maybe the last question for the panel, but I think it's a really, really good point that I did say that I didn't want your comments, which is probably antithetical to this entire process. So I stand corrected, and I appreciate your comments, and welcome comments for other people as long as they're kind of geared towards this particular discussion. Sometimes, like for our events that I host, sometimes people make just long comments that aren't really necessary and don't use the time as effectively. So I really apologize for that. And David, I think you can field the last part of that question.
Well, I could try. So there is nothing in the WSIS document that created the Internet Governance Forum that demands panels. In fact, I think Dick Beard and Fiona Alexander, who are here, who are also present at the creation of the IGF, we're just amazed it exists at this stage. It's really quite extraordinary. It was really designed to get us out of Tunisia alive back in 2005. The way in which it has evolved, and there is a very important ongoing process of evaluation of the IGF and the processes, is the MAG, which is the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, is looking at these issues, at how it's formed. There are various different parts of it. And I frankly can't think of any good reason why you wouldn't have a roundtable, either as part of it or as on the margins of it.
All right, so any more comments from the audience? They are certainly welcome. Right here.
Got one up front here.
Kathleen McInerney with Yahoo. And listening to Ambassador Gross's statements, it made me think of a couple of questions around what is the forgotten community that seems to be left out of this conversation a lot, which is the technical community, which is really important, right? So they were the 5th group in Net Mundial. And in my opinion, the hardest group to actually engage, and yet some of the most important voices in the conversation. So I'm wondering, what is it that we can do to actually reach out more to the technical community and have ways to involve them more in our conversations?
I think we have a number of people from the technical community in the audience. Maybe some of them would like to address. I mean, just from the Internet Society perspective, I mean, the irony is that, in some part, from my perspective is, a lot of these principles about sort of openness, anybody can have a voice, anybody can come up to a microphone, et cetera. These are, fundamental principles that were developed in large part initially within the technical community. And I think many of them still obviously remain quite open. Anybody can go to an IETF meeting and jump up on the microphone and comment on an issue. But since we have others from the technical community in the room, I was wondering if there's any of them that want to address the question.
Microphone up here in the front row, please. And Professor DeNardis, you've talked quite a bit about all these different types of multi-stakeholder processes, one of which is, I think your golden model is the IETF, right? So you talk about quite a bit about that.
Right, well, the Internet Engineering Task Force is a big part of the technical community, and it's quite easy to engage with them because they have such open and participatory processes. Not only can anyone attend the events and participate, but you can also get involved online. So I think it's fairly easy to engage in that technical community, and then there's also a spectrum of other organizations that aren't as open.
Yeah, and so the technical community, the lists are, Sean Turner, I guess I've been involved in the IETF since, I don't know, the mid-90s. Steve and some others have been involved in the IETF for longer, and I was on the ISG for a while. I guess now I'm on the ISOC Board of Trustees. The community is open. It's IETF.org. All the mailing lists are open. You can participate for free. There actually are lots of, I call them nerds, in and around and involved and listening very carefully. And one of the neat things that happens is that I've worked with people on the internet for years that I've never met and probably never will meet. We write documents and technical things all the time. And I'd actually like to, talk about the Travel Club. Maybe the next IGF meeting or group, don't have it face-to-face. Do it online. Use the technology that we actually have. There's plenty of things that you can do that are real-time, and you can also use email. It's been around for a while, and it works great. And it lets anybody join and use it.
Would you agree with the premise of the question, which was that the technical community is not as involved as it should be?
I think it depends on what you mean by the technical community. But there's lots of people that are involved pretty heavily and deeply, like the meeting that's happening for ICANN and stuff. There's IAB, IETF, ISOC, lots of people.
Hi, Eric Berger. I'll put my Internet Society hat on as well. And some of us actually, wear shoes. So Sean dressed up, I dressed up, I put on a tie. And part of it is, what do we mean by the technical community? Because, I guess I am firmly from the technical community. It's kind of a nebulous thing. Does every person come and participate? No, but a lot of them would be very happy. In fact, really happy to do stuff over the internet because it means I wouldn't have to speak to a person face to face. And others, actually like to go all over. So there is a lot of engagement already. The Internet Society facilitates a lot of it with the IETF. W3C has a foundation that does a lot of stuff. And then there's this other group in Geneva that seems to be pretty engaged as well.
So what are those processes like IETF? Why do they work? What are the elements that people agree that IETF works? What is it about IETF that makes it work?
A lot of it is controlled anarchy. And in fact, it's the best or worst of multi-stakeholder. Because we have no hierarchy, but if you don't come from the hierarchy, you will get your head bitten off the first time you show up because you don't know our cultural norms and you learn them the hard way. It is consensus-based, no votes, and a person can be a dictator, and we allow that because usually that person tends to 98% of the time be right. And so it's not a hard and fast rule, it's not a hard and fast cookbook. But over time, it seems to have worked.
I have a comment from Twitter from Avri. It says, the panel on IGF USA acting as if multi-stakeholderism is hard to define. It isn't. It's just hard to live up to.
And actually, in the shameless self-promotion department, if you come to the next session that'll be in this room after the break, comments very much encouraged. In fact, that was part of the ground rules for having that Internet of Things big data session is we're going to be getting a lot of stuff from the audience, a lot more than from the panel.
Wow, you're just piling on, aren't you? All right, any more questions and comments, please?
Hi, I'm Erica Portnoy. I'm an undergraduate in computer science, so I guess part of the technical community. And I was actually wondering about living up to that multi-stakeholder governance model. So from like a theoretical kind of having ideals perspective, it makes great sense there. But when it comes time to actually execute, how do you deal with those overlaps, those competing interests? So I remember, for example, you were saying that you could allow business agreements, but you could construe the whole net neutrality debate in terms of business agreements, which is what some people are doing. So what do you do when you have these conflicts? How do you resolve them from a governance perspective?
I think the question was geared towards your business agreements comment.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm actually writing a paper right now called Multi-Stakeholderism, Anatomy of an Inchoate institution, because I don't agree that it's really obvious what multi-stakeholderism is. I think that just like there's no one internet governance system, that there, even within multi-stakeholderism, there's not one model. So each model differs based on the actors that are involved. And ideally, you want to have civil society representation, you want private sector representation, and you want government representation, right? But it also differs based on the authority relations between those actors. And I think it's really not clear what the best kind of implementation is, in a homogeneous way. In some models, it makes sense to have different kinds of authority relations where one actor has someone has to make a decision at some point in certain environments, and someone has the hands on the keyboard in other environments, right? So there are different kinds of responsibilities. In other cases, it's more, the former I would I'm just using a term from international relations, please forgive me. It's heterogeneous polyarchy. In other cases, it's homogeneous, where you have actors having the same kind of voice and an equal vote. So I think that there are different kinds of arrangements, and how you operationalize that, I agree with Avri in the sense that that's the crux of the problem, is how to operationalize that and what is appropriate in each environment.
Sarah?
I think just to add on to that, I think that one of the things that gets particularly tricky and confusing when it comes to implementing the value systems that are associated with multi-stakeholder governance is the fact that there are situations in which some of those values are not complementary. So for example, if you want to have a participatory model, in order to get everybody in the room to discuss strategic issues or national security issues, it may necessarily not be able to be fully transparent. So sort of seeing those values on a continuum and trying to figure out the way to maximize them to the best, outcome of a free and open and stable and effective internet, I think is the tricky calculation that goes into multi-stakeholder governance.
We have a question from the front row here.
Thanks, Tim. My name is Marilyn Cade. You heard a little bit from me this morning. I actually want to take us back to two comments that were made earlier. I hear us trying to give a perfect, in some cases, we're trying to give a perfect definition of what multi-stakeholder might be. Laura, I tend to agree with much of the way you've defined this, and I also agree with Aubrey that whatever multi-stakeholder is, in whatever forum we're practicing it is hard to live up to, but I think it also varies significantly. And I want to go back actually to a comment made earlier by, I believe it was Marion Gordon from the State Department, that referenced the WSIS plus 10 consultation process and the high-level event. We spent a year practicing with a group of participants. Anyone could sign up for it. It was largely governments, but it did include other stakeholders. And we spent a year coming together and negotiating text and working. And it was tough, I will say. I actually don't agree with the comment that the ending was a little messy. I think the ending was a miracle, because the outcome document, like the Tunis agenda, is a document that it isn't just that it doesn't do harm, it sets the stage for recognizing the further evolution of multi-stakeholder engagement in evaluating the rest of the WSIS documents. But what I saw, and the reason I use this as an example, I saw governments and business and civil society over that year of meetings coming together, learning to relate to each other very differently, changing their attitude toward each other. And we went from referring to each other by placards that said a country name or business to actually in that meeting referring to each other by name. And in meetings where governments are coming together to negotiate and they're used to only sitting behind a placard that has a country name, and they start referring to themselves by name and to the other stakeholders by name, that was a huge shift to me. It was a real role model of maybe a small change, but I think a change that this kind of interaction can bring, where we start learning about issues and people's views and respecting the speaker and the difference as well as the commonality. So when I think about what we're trying to do and I think, Tim, you had made a reference about, so what is the IGF USA about? I hope that's what we're about.
Tim, just to follow up on Marilyn's comment, Marilyn always has great comments, and this is a particularly good one, because I think one of the keys, when we think about the evolution of internet governance, one of the key issues is the evolution of how different parties relate to one another. And I think this brings also back to this issue that there's no one internet governance a model or system or multi-stakeholder model that is particularly, one size fits all for every context. But one of the keys is how are the parties within that context of the discussion relating to one another? And I think over the last couple of years, one of the biggest steps we've made with the evolution of internet governance is how different parties, how different actors are relating to one another. And one of the great steps is that I think it's built a lot of trust. And in order to make good decisions, you have to have trust. So the evolution of how people relate and how people trust one another in decision making, I think, is going to be a key to the success of the overall governance of this model.
Thank you, Karen, Marilyn. We have a comment from up here with the
Hi there. My name's Evan Leibovich. I'm here involved with the Internet Society Canada chapter, but for the moment I'm going to put on my hat as being vice chair of the at-large community in ICANN. At the London meeting, there was a sort of sub-meeting that brought together people from across the world within at-large. It only happens once every 5 or so years. And they had a number of subtopics and plenaries they were doing themselves, and one of them was on this very topic. One of the only things that they could agree on, and they came to the conclusion very quickly, was to get rid of the ism in multi-stakeholderism. And that it connotes two things. Number one, that there was a single approach. It's been widely said here, one size doesn't fit all. I was in Brazil. I was delighted, like Marilyn said, at the innovation of the approach of Net Mundial. I'm hoping to see other approaches as well. We've got ICANN, we've got IETF, we've got Net Mundial. But the other thing about an ism is an ism tends to connote faith, almost like a religion. And when you start thinking that using multi-stakeholder approaches are a means to an end rather than the end in itself, that sort of frames the thinking in a way that we sort of thought was very necessary. So I just want to add that into this. The original name of the group was The Future of Multi-Stakeholderism. First thing we did was change the title. Thanks.
I have one question that I'd like to ask the panel just really quickly. And then if we have a few more minutes, we'll ask for more comments and questions to the audience. So IGF was, WSIS was almost 10 years ago when you were ambassador at State. And the first ICANN meeting was about, 18 years ago? That's a lot, in a short period of time, a lot has happened on the evolution of this internet governance ecosystem. It's evolving as we speak. I mentioned that the Snowden revelations were only 13 months ago. It's hard to even imagine that was only 13 months ago. So that's the first 10 years of internet governance, so to speak. And we've dealt with a lot has happened on the technical level, whether it be ICANN, moving from John Postel to ICANN to affirmation of commitments, and now the IANA function is moving off out of the government purview. What do you see, 10 years from now, which would be 2024, 2025? What do you think internet governance is going to be like, and what issues will we be dealing with, and how will we be dealing with them in 2025? I know it's a hard question, but just brainstorm on that.
So looking forward and then walking it back, my biggest concern is in 2020 saying, remember how cool the internet was in 2014? And you used to be able to do everything on your mobile device, and I could call a taxi, and I could pay all my bills, and everything was in my mobile device right in my hand. And then it got fragmented because we didn't watch what we needed to in the cyber area, or we let sovereignty get the better of the global element, and it just wasn't as interesting because content wasn't available. So I always think about that and walk it backwards towards what I'm working on today.
I would like to heap onto that and agree wholeheartedly. I think that whether justified or not, there is some loss of trust both in the internet and in the institutions that administer the internet. And we see all kinds of reactions to that, including efforts to route around internet exchange points, data localization laws, all kinds of efforts that fragment content in various ways, and that this is not a good thing for the future of the internet. There also is a resurgence of proprietary protocols, and for a lot of people in this room who made the difficult move from the proprietary technologies of different vendors pre-1990s and then went through the proprietary online systems of the 1990s, that's a really horrifying thought to see that we are moving away from universality. So what I hope happens is that those kinds of politically driven efforts that could move us towards fragmentation are circumvented in some way, and that we can continue to have a universal internet.
Anyone free to jump in on 2025? Okay. Question from Mr. Lane right here in the aisle, and we'll go back up to this gentleman who has had his hand up.
You brought up a good point about sovereignty and fragmentation of the internet because of governments taking control. I think one of the things that we all have to realize, though, is that governments are always going to want to try to protect their citizens. whether how they believe or what they do may be right or wrong, but there's a general sense, we like to think that governments are here to protect our citizens. So I think too often, and what we try to push with the IGF for governments to attend, is here's a place you can go that isn't the ITU, that isn't kind of the UN. It's a place where you can go and get ideas of how to protect your citizens online in a way that allows, and David knows I like this term, the seamless flow of information across the net. Because you're always going to have countries that are going to have rules. In our industry, in the movie industry, there are content limitations. You know, we can't have certain number of movies in certain countries, or there's certain things we can't say. And we understand that. We live within that rule, but we like to have all of our movies in every country. So it's more of a seamless flow. Or if you look at the EU privacy laws versus the US privacy laws, you had a safe harbor in place that allowed for a seamless flow of data to go back and forth within the rules of each of those countries and the EU. So we, instead of pushing governments away all the time that we tend to do because we're so afraid they're going to screw it up, sometimes you have to figure out a way of how do we help them move forward in a way to achieve their goals of protecting their citizens, at the same time allow for all these great apps and things to flow across the net. And maybe put it into that perspective instead of constantly bashing them and saying you don't have a role, government has no role on the internet. They do. They protect privacy, they protect contracts when you go to a judge, they protect citizens from harm and counterfeit goods. So we got to acknowledge that, I think, a little bit more and make them part of the process instead of kicking them out of the room every time they come in. A comment.
Please.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't think anyone on the panel said that there's no role for government, but now I'll say that. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I just want to. Obviously there's a huge. There's a huge role for governments in various. So, computer fraud and abuse, child protection, privacy laws, intellectual property rights protection, trade agreements. Obviously, there is a whole litany of areas that governments are involved in. But I do want to just push back a little bit. I'm always so interested why people look to governments for the answer for all of this, and that's not what you're doing. But when you look, so the reason that the U.S. oversight of the root zone file has been fairly successful, and I know it's going to transition because of it's been a hands-off approach. It's been a light touch, and there are a lot of areas like that facilitate freedom of expression and commerce to continue. But if you look at governments overall and their record on the internet, it's not a good one. So we had Egypt and many countries cutting off internet access entirely. We have massive systems of filtering and censorship throughout the world. And we have all kinds of surveillance practices around the world. So I would say that, just to throw a caveat, but I agree with you that there's a lot of role for government.
I think Karen had there's a gentleman right up there, and we're running out of time. There's a if I'm not mistaken, there's a break at 2:20. It's on the third floor outside. It's a beautiful day. You're welcome to. It's a half an hour break, and then we're back with additional sessions in the afternoon on ICANN and other things. The question from that gentleman.
Hi, my name is Misha Benacor from Open Reporter. I represent the tech startup community, and as many of us know, the tech startup community knows to be as the disruptor in internet technology. We push the evolution of what we can use the internet for. So the question is, where do we play in this, and what role would you like the tech startup community to help in the evolution of internet governance?
That's a good question. Not that the other ones were bad. Tech startups, what role do they play? I mean, we're talking about a lot of different, fora, discussions, and these people, the tech startup community is trying to just get their startups off the ground.
Yeah, I think having more innovators in the room is a great thing. One of the reasons why we say these models need to be preserved and the internet needs to be preserved as open is so innovation can happen. And the more that we have innovators, the startup community in the room to talk about how the issues that are being discussed impact your ability to start up and be successful, the more likely we are to come out with good solutions that take into account, I think, one of the fundamental reasons why we say multi-stakeholder or open internet governance and transparency and processes is so important, is to continue the open and innovative internet. So I think we need to see more of the startup community and more of the innovators in the discussions.
So this is just the start of a conversation, and it should continue. Comments are always welcome, not only online, suggested by the technical community, but also on the third floor mezzanine outside over cookies. Feel free to come to me with any comments that you'd like. I am totally open to them, and thank you, IGF USA, for this lesson in humility. And I want to say thank you to Susan Aronson, the project leader on this. Thank you so much, everybody.